Abend zwei Gäste, einer aus ganz Europa und der andere aus Belgien.
Wer ist jetzt fair?
Das erkläre ich jetzt. Kennengelernt habe ich Kersten Geers, unser Architekt für heute Abend, bei einer Reise durch Italien, die von der Zeitschrift San Rocco organisiert wurde, die er auch mit gegründet hat. Das Ziel war, die Gebäude von Bramante zu studieren. Es war eine beeindruckende, wenn auch etwas chaotische, weil italienische Reise, an der wir alle unseren Spaß hatten. Ich musste mein deutsches Kontrollwesen so unter Kontrolle haben. Wir haben dann manchmal um 11 Uhr abends gegessen und es war einfach, aber es war super nett und super spannend. Er ist 1995 in Genf geboren.
Was?
75. in Genf geboren. Er hat an der University of Genf studiert und später auch in Madrid. Er arbeitete in einigen Architekturbüros in Rotterdam, bis er in 2002 mit David van Severen ein eigenes Architekturbüro in Brüssel gründete.
Oh, nee.
Das Büro ist mittlerweile sehr erfolgreich.
Meine Herren?
Das Büro ist mittlerweile sehr erfolgreich und mit großen und kleinen Projekten in Belgien, der Schweiz und ganz Europa sowie auch international. Er war Professor an der University of Gent und an der Columbia University in New York und auch in Medrisio. Seine jetzigen Lehraufträge sind in der EPFL in Lausanne und Harvard Graduate School of Design in Boston. Mittlerweile hat er eine Reputation erarbeitet, die ihn als wichtige Stimme im heutigen Architekturdiskurs herausstellt. Seine Architektur sowie seine wissenschaftliche Arbeit und Lehre stellen ihn als ein wichtiger Denker unserer Zeit. Sein Werk beruht auf der Geometrie und der Architekturgeschichte, sodass er sich in diesem Hause, glaube ich, sehr wohl fühlt. Ja? Christoph Grafe kenne ich auch schon seit mehreren Jahren und freue mich, dass er heute Abend unser Gast ist. Christoph Grafe ist zwar 1964 in Deutschland geboren, aber ist im wahrsten Sinne ein Europäer. Er ist ein vielschichtiger Denker, der als Architekt, Kurator, Autor und Lehrer tätig ist. An der Technischen Universität Delft studierte er Architektur und der Architectural Association in London, Architekturgeschichte und Theorie. Von 2011 bis 2017 hat er das Flämische Architekturinstitut mit Sitz in Antwerpen geleitet, wo er viele spannende und grenzüberschreitende Veranstaltungen organisierte. Unter vielen Lehraufträgen und Gastprofessuren lehrte er auch an der TU Delft. 2013 wurde er Professor für Architekturgeschichte und Theorie an der Bergischen Universität in Wuppertal. Er hat mehrere Bücher geschrieben, darunter das Buch People's Palaces, Architecture, Culture and Democracy in Post-War Western Europe und viele Beiträge in Magazinen und Büchern publiziert. Herr Grafe ist Herausgeber des Architekturmagazins OASE und für uns in NRW ist auch interessant, dass er Teil des Kuratoriums vom Baukunstarchiv in Dortmund ist. Die Veranstaltung ist wie immer und dankensweise von FSB gesponsert, die ihr neues Buch von Tatjana Bilbao mitgebracht haben für Sie, sowie auch weitere andere Bücher, die draußen vorliegen und die Sie mitnehmen können und dann auch studieren. Es ist immer eine wunderbare Lektüre. Wir sind auch von AIP und Fortis Immobilien sponsert. Die sind, glaube ich, heute nicht anwesend, aber wir danken in Abwesenheit. Dann würde ich sagen, rede ich mich nicht mehr länger, sondern überlasse das Wort Christoph Grafe und seinen Hittorf.
Well, first of all, I can of course thank the UNGAS Archive, Sophia and Anja, very much for the invitation. It's a great event, a great honor also, and a great pleasure. Because what you didn't say, but perhaps we weren't prepared. Kersten and I had one publishing project together, which was an OASE issue on the work of James Stirling. And so it's a nice way of seeing each other again.
More sexy images than
Yeah, that's exactly. I did actually bring this for you.
Okay.
I thought, yeah, because I know Kersten is a lover of sexy images and of David Hockney, and I thought, David Hockney is about color. Now I have this wonderful thing where I actually talk about color, and you don't. Anyway, yes, color. It's all about color. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, not only to speak, but also to talk. I thought, about a book that you always wanted to look at and read and never managed to. And then, of course, you could say, well, do we actually read these books? The book I finally selected, after going through the extensive catalogue, I mean, that's an experience in itself. I think 15,000 titles. That was, evenings well spent. Anyway, this book is not exactly a reading book. Rather, you could describe it, perhaps, as some kind of a bit of a coffee table book. Well, of course, that's a bit, perhaps not giving it enough honor, but it is something of a book that you would want to lay out on a table with perhaps a glass of port securely placed at a distance. For it is also a precious book. This restitution of the temple of Selinante, or Selinus as it is also called, which we discuss today. It's a book made up of delicate and exquisite plates, generously laid out on cream-colored paper. A book also, as the frontispiece shows us, that overwhelms the onlooker with its great abundance of color. I think you see this. This is actually the title. Restitution du temple à Selinante and l'architecture polychrome chez les Grecs. It's a book. Well, perhaps I should say, as you always do, you never know exactly what you're going to choose. Anja actually told me, well, take this one, you've got good images. Thank you for that. And then I thought, okay, Anja thinks I'm, give him an easy book. One that is full of plates and color. She said, well, you show attractive images, which is good, then people don't look at you, you see. Anyway. Then, yes, it was very much a colored book. And one which I found actually reflected the technological advances in the, let's say, in the technology of printing in the first half of the 19th century, which I'm also going to talk about. But also because color, as it turned out, is quite literally the catalyst for the importance and the perhaps rhetorical success of this book. So all of this is a happy incident, and thank you very much. For this evening, we can talk about the story of an architect who, by digging in the distant past of antiquity, changed the course of architecture, I would argue, to the present day, but also an architect who perhaps was not quite aware of the significance of his findings himself. We talk about Jakob Ignaz Hittorff or Jakob Ignaz Hittorff. First of all, who is this man? I've got two images, which I show you, from different, well, both of the young Hittorff. I have to say that Hittorff was quite aware of a certain tendency towards corpulence, and made very sure that later in his life he was always painted slightly favorably. We have the two images here. On the right, of course, the image of the traveler to Italy. He didn't do what Goethe did. He might have done. I thought the little drawing by Ingres on the left is actually very interesting because you see somebody who's fantastically self-confident. Actually, I do recognize a certain similarity here, don't I? I mean, it's only the hair, but anyway. I couldn't say that. Anyway, what is this? And what is this Hittorff person? Hittorf is, above all, associated with the contributions to the Parisian urban transformations of the mid-19th century. The summer circus near the Champs-Élysées, no longer extant. The winter circus near the Place de la République, that is still there. It's actually this one. The intriguing and mysteriously ornate church of Saint-Vincent de Paul, near sort of north of the city. And although not many travelers are aware of this, the Gare du Nord, a building in which he showed himself a fairly flexible designer who mastered the dichotomy between the eternal architecture of stone and the new one, the architecture of iron and glass. Hittorf, I would argue, as he appears from his buildings, was one of the authors of a very specific type of Parisian modernity. Elegant and not without cultural ambition, even when the functional program did not necessarily demand it. That's, for example, with the Cirque d'Hiver. And of course, sorry, that's it, yep. His responsibility for the renewal of the plan of Paris with the royal axis, starting at the Place de la Concorde, joined the Bois de Boulogne via the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, lent Hittorf the position of an architect everyone, and even the Baron Haussmann, had to reckon with. In fact, he stood up against Haussmann on one occasion and won a legal battle, and Haussmann never forgave him, but he was a formidable person, obviously. This is why he was already considered a celebrated architect during his lifetime. After his death, a French obituary described him as the celebrity of our century. So that's a century before Koolhaas. And a Parisian weekly newspaper pointed out his works, given a indelible imprint at this period in Paris. And basically his work was everywhere. Here we have the Gare du Nord. It's also true there's even an idea that there's a Paris of Hittorf. I have an image which comes a bit later of a map of all the interventions of Hittorf in the Parisian landscape, and there are a lot. And they are also from the very everyday kiosks, sort of commercial things, to, high-end state works. The second thing, which was really interesting, is that he was, of course, I will talk a little about his background. He was an immigrant. He was an immigrant arrivé who came from the Rhineland, from Cologne to be precise, and who clearly had a particular talent for associating himself with the different political regimes in France at this period. From the Bourbons, who were reinstated in 1814, and then a second time definitively after Waterloo, to the Roi Citoyen, Louis-Philippe after 1830, and then Hittorf managed to serve them all. They may have been very worried, he clearly wasn't. This is, of course, what is it? Louis XVIII, who is robbed from his sleep because he's the fear of revolution. And of course, France is always good at revolutions. But Hittorf, survived them all. You could also say that perhaps his, let's say, social and political flexibility, let's call it, a healthy talent for opportunistic change of allegiance, that this was perhaps also one of the reasons why he is not all that well known today. So he was perhaps too much of a sort of person inside the circles of the time, not somebody whom we remember as the great artist. But we'll talk about that. Let me briefly say something about his background. He is from Cologne, hence his name, Jakob Ignaz Hittorff. He is from actually a background, let's say a family of great social mobility. The father was a tinsmith, a Blechner, who made good in the secularization of 1806 in buying, among other things, the monastery or the convent of the Clarissinnen, the poor ladies, and cheaply, of course, and made that into a women's prison. And he got a chap called Putz to do the building work. And that also meant that this combination of two people became rather known in the Cologne colloquial as Blechner Putz. And in fact, what was it called? It was called the Klingelputz is the second thing. Anyway, so this Klingelputz history is related to the family of Hittorf. His father worked himself up, let's say, into the upper echelons of the Cologne bourgeoisie. Had, of course, great hopes for his only son, Jakob Ignaz. Did a lot of work to make sure that he actually learned the arts, but also a proper trade. So Hittorf is taught by a mason, but he's not a proper ordinary mason. He's already sort of primed for being an architect. He designs a building in the inner city of Cologne. This is actually an early work of Jakob Ignaz Hittorf. Needless to say, it's no longer there. But of course, we can reconstruct anything these days. And then, what happens? Hittorf decides that Cologne isn't really where he wants to spend his life. We don't know exactly as for the motives, but we do know that clearly Daddy was fully in favor and actually bankrolled his sons going to Paris. And that is where he arrives in about 1810. He enrolls with his friend Franz Christian Gau, at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. There he studies with all the relevant people, among others Charles Percier, who may also turn up in your talk, perhaps, because it's the...
No history, my talk.
Okay. Okay. Percier Fontaine, this is actually also a beautiful book, which is also in the archive. Percier Fontaine were perhaps the inventors of the Empire style. They designed the Malmaison, the Palais de Tuileries, the interiors. So Hittorf really lands his career in Paris quite immediately. Percier also recommends the young Hittorf for the work of another important architect, the architect of the king, François Bélanger, who at that moment is involved in the design of the Halles aux Blés in the center of Paris. Incidentally, one of the very first buildings where a kind of integration of iron and glass and real architecture was attempted. And then, this is, all part of the career moves. By the way, I'm just going to, this is from Percier Fontaine. This is also from Percier Fontaine. I'll show the two because we are going to talk about color. This is the beautiful book on interiors by Percier Fontaine, and it's all black and white. And of course, if you think that the real things were black and white, you're quite mistaken. And this is, of course, very much also a question of today. Now, to cut things short, because we do want to talk about the book as well, Hittorf and Gau make it into the service of the royal household of the reinstated Bourbon. They work, incidentally, for Bélanger. Bélanger dies. They inherit, especially Hittorf actually inherits the office and is then responsible for a series of decorations for the main events of the Bourbon dynasty. And one thing is the baptism of the Duke of Bordeaux, future King of France, in 1821. Now, this is actually an interesting and important event. You wouldn't think that. For Hittorf it is. Because he has had a misfortune. And the misfortune is that he was born as a French citizen in what was then French-occupied Cologne. Cologne becomes part of Prussia, not entirely voluntarily, I think. And that means he's stripped of his French nationality. He is in Paris, meaning that, with the result that he is not eligible for the Prix de Rome. And of course, not being eligible for the Prix de Rome is a real career obstacle. He works very successfully on these decorations, though. And Percier and some people surrounding him clearly think he needs to do something about finishing his education. And what he does is, after this rather successful career as a royal decorator, he asks for a possible leave for traveling. He does a few travels before a longer one. He goes to England. In fact, it's very interesting. He goes to England, looks primarily at everyday buildings. This is noted by all the biographers. He's not looking at the great monuments. He learns English very quickly, so everybody's impressed by his command of the language. He goes to Germany, and there's actually a little anecdote which I will also talk about, because he also meets Karl Friedrich Schinkel, who is his guide in Berlin, and then says, Mr. Schinkel has much taste and talent for painting and decorative painting. He's a man of great merit, but he lacks the essentials to be a good architect. Nevertheless, I think he is still the most capable man in Germany, and it's a good fortune for the King of Prussia to have him. Now, I thought I share this little thing with you. Of course, you could say Hittorf, who had made it in Paris, thought, this man from the village cannot be possibly, that interesting. There was probably a sort of Parisian Dadain here. Or he didn't realize that Schinkel was actually he had much greater creative freedom. He simply didn't recognize the creative freedom. We don't know. Anyway, these were the two travels he was first engaged in. But then, of course, there was still the big thing, and that's Italy. An architectural career without Italy is impossible, is not complete. So, yeah, I think still, well, you traveled in Italy. We just learned. The thing is that he then really plays his card very well. He has very good connections. The family of the king actually owe him something, because he's just done this decoration for their baptism. And he writes to the ministre secrétaire d'État de la Maison du Roi, a certain Marquis de Lauriston, saying, 12 years of successful academic studies and practice of architecture and the direction of many projects I have been responsible for, blah, 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 not having allowed me to undertake the journey to Italy, so necessary to develop the knowledge and talent of artists in general, and especially in architects, I would like to make myself more worthy of Her Majesty's trust to undertake this useful pilgrimage and obtain, for this purpose, from you a leave of absence of 1.5 years. This is the shortest time to be able to visit, examine, and study with success some of the masterpieces of which this beautiful country is so rich. Now, so you could say he knew how to make a useful demand. He gets the leave, and even more, he gets actually equipment. He gets money to bring with himself quite an equipe, one collaborator for the whole trip, and then initially more people. And also Daddy from Cologne also gives some money. So he's actually well endowed. So we go to Rome. This starts in 1821, and there are bits of it which are a bit like a sort of detective story. They leave for Italy, they go to Turin first, they see the work of Juvara. He's very impressed by that. He's a bit nervous about his companion, Sand, because he thinks he's a bit sort of nerdy, but Sand turns out to be extremely useful over time. Then they go to Rome and immerse themselves immediately in the relevant circles, live in a house which they share with Bertel Thorvaldsen, the famous Danish sculptor, and meet everyone, basically. But then Hittorf clearly thought, I need to find something where I can make a mark. And what he does is he decides to go to Sicily. For this, I would like to quote Robin Middleton, who was actually rather naughty about and impolite about Hittorf, but this is a nice description. In July, Hittorf, this is July 1822, Hittorf left for Sicily together with Sand, who was hired as an additional draftsman. In Palermo, Harris, one of the people who'd actually worked on one of the major sites in Sicily, Selinante, had died from malaria, so there was no competition there. And the other one, Angel, had actually brought some metapiece back from the site, but had also left the site. Then something quite funny happens. They go to Selinante, which is this. That's the site. It's one of the major sites of Magna Graecia in Sicily. Here we see it's a city that was originally near the sea. The new modern city is actually quite some way away. This is a drawing of Messina by Hittorf. This is a drawing of Selinante, the site by Hittorf. There wasn't very much there. None of the temples were actually in reality visible. They start digging. And then there was another man, also in southern Italy, Leo von Klenze. Leo von Klenze, who has quite defined ideas about Greek architecture. He's the one, for example, who tells Karl Friedrich Schinkel that his ideas of a rebuilding of the Acropolis are not correct, and who defines and defends, actually, Greek propriety. So von Klenze is there, but von Klenze has a problem, because von Klenze is with the Bavarian crown prince. Hittorf, by contrast, is on his own, has by this time an equipe of 19 people. So he's already in Selinante. Von Klenze had obviously got wind of these findings and thought, perhaps I can sort of do a bit of research there. Turns up. And then what happens is, of course, depends on who describes it. Apparently, and this is in fact in the biography of von Klenze, apparently Hittorf was all the gentleman. Man nahm den Konkurrenten höflich auf. But then, behind that mask of politesse, things got a bit shirty, because clearly the two didn't hit it off at all. Hittorf thought von Klenze is just a Bavarian bully. Perhaps he was. And Hittorf was, of course, now not only a congenial Rhenanian, but also a Parisian, so he had probably better manners. Perhaps he was also just much more mercurial. In any case, the meeting clearly was not entirely amicable. And von Klenze apparently even found spying on the site. And Hittorf doesn't like that at all, of course. Von Klenze, in any case, leaves, goes to Agrigento, hoping that he might do some work there. Hittorf is so, let's say, pissed off that he actually writes a little note to a certain R. Politi, I haven't looked him up, who is doing the excavations in Agrigento, and warns him against von Klenze. So not only Anyway, not only has Hittorf been able to defend his site, but also did a little bit of obstructing work for the Bavarian. Any case, I have to say that the sketches by von Klenze of Stellenante actually look rather better than those by Hittorf. I mean, just the sort of landscape drawings. What did they do? Well, first of all, Hittorf had these 19 people. He's very proud that he actually discovers a fourth temple on the site. There are not just 3, but there are 4. So he can claim the prize for discovering a Greek temple. And then they do a lot of drawings, these are in fact some of the remaining, I understand, the few remaining sketches, measuring sketches of Hittorf and his equipe in Stellenante, which are in the Municipal Archive in Cologne. Yeah? And you can see it looks a bit scruffy, but it's very precise. We have the metopes, we have the exact drawings, and then there's also this sketch, which is of course the interesting one, because they start to speculate on something they find on the remnants, which is traces of color. I think that is what the literature suggests, is that they are initially not entirely aware of the explosive nature of this finding. But anyway, on these sketches we have these watercolor indications of paint on the ancient monuments and a few other things. What happens next? They go back to Paris. We talk later in the year 1823. And Hittorf has already written to important people about his findings, also about the findings of the paint. The person, he gets full support from his Charles Percier, his former teacher. He then has a lecture at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in which he explains this color findings, the paint findings. The lecture is called Mémoire sur un voyage en Sicile, and it's in July 1824, so it slightly coincides with Letarouilly. He does discuss the paint, and the reaction of the Academy initially is actually cautiously positive. But then Hittorf and his helper Zahn start to prepare a series of documents, a series of books, actually 2. One of the ancient architecture, that is of the findings at Stellenante, and another one of Sicile moderne, which is actually quite comparable to the Letarouilly, where they show where they want to show, or Hittorf wants to show, the continuity from ancient Greece or Magna Graecia through the architecture, the very colored architecture of Montreal and especially of the interiors of the Norman Romanesque churches, through Baroque. And they make the claim that, for example, there are certain technologies in Sicily, such as terracotta, painted and glazed, that probably have a kind of direct connection between antiquity and the present. So this Sicile moderne, which is also in the archive, is important as a sort of counter publication. What they do is they collect all the material, they collect all they prepare these 2 publications, and these publications were going to be by subscription, a very exclusive group of subscribers, including Alexander von Humboldt. They were going to be hand-colored. And meanwhile, Hittorf's findings start to caused an uproar. First of all, what was he trying to do? Perhaps I should do this first. There is, of course, a whole history of these books of findings from antiquity. The most famous one, most influential one is Stuart and Revet, 1762, starting the Antiquities of Athens, where you find they do the first measurings of the Parthenon of and the different temples on the Acropolis. They also have these beautiful copper plates, engravings of what the Parthenon looked like in the middle of mosques and cow sheds. This is their reconstruction. Now, what is important is that, of course, it's always suggested that this is monochromatic architecture. There is no color here. Despite the fact that Stuart and Revet actually make notice of paint remnants being found on the temple of Ilyssus outside Athens. But there's no color here. Then we have, of course, Winkelmann, who says color assists beauty, it heightens beauty and its form, but it does not constitute it. So there is a strong, let's say, bias towards seeing the buildings of classical antiquity as monochromatic. There is, and this is much longer, this is a beautiful book from the 1920s of buildings from Sicily, and you know that kind of reception of Doric architecture, which is so strongly present also in modern architecture. Le Corbusier has it. André Lursat has a very extensive study of this, and there's a very beautiful study of Max Raphael of the Doric Temple. So it's actually this is a modernist trope, but of course this is never really thought of as in color. Quatremaire de Quincy, who's the secretary of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in 1804, however, suggests that the sculpture might have been in color. And this is actually one of his publications. So there is a sort of suggestion there may be color, but in the case of Quatremaire de Quincy, only for the sculpture. So what happens then, and I'm not going into detail, but there is a sort of absolutely intensive struggle between scholars and the architect. The architect claiming, being more and more outright about it, that the stone is covered in mortar and transparent wax layer. The columns, we're going to see this, in strong yellow, red walls of the cellar, capitals, various colors, I mean really multicolored, and it gets more and more colored. The scholars say, you're wrong, Mr. Architect, you just want to think that, we know better. And then there are some people in the academy, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but there is actually a sort of standoff between those two camps. Then the whole thing is also replaced or sort of relocates itself to Germany, where both positions find their supporters. The most famous one is Gottfried Semper, who in 1831 writes an article in support of Hittorf, and the only difference is that Semper actually thought it was even more colorful. Probably the columns were going to be red. Anyway, all of this, I mean, it's interesting to think of the politics of color here, because during all of this time, the pensionaries of the Prix de Rome were not allowed to travel to Greece by the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Why not? Because Quatremaire de Quincy and his successor, also double name, Raoul Rouchet, who is described invariably as pompous and attacking Hittorf as not being scholarly, they effectively formulate an embargo for people to go to Greece in case they might actually look at this multicolored Greek architecture. So, yeah, but eventually Hittorf is actually supported and confounded. Here we have the entablature of the temple at Selinante, and I only did the entablature so you get an idea of how wild this was. And this is the columns. They're actually quite saturated yellow. And then there also, this is what Hittorf thinks was the Pantheon was like, and what happened between the metopes. And this was an alternative scheme. And this is actually another plate from the book. Now, I'm going through the book very quickly. Of course, we've got this absolutely mind-bogglingly strange frontispiece, Phidias painting the architecture. So you could say this is a naughty book. And what do we get? We get, well, I mean, first of all, when we looked at this book together a week before last, Sophie almost thought, I mean, this must be hand-painted because it's so beautifully, exquisitely printed that you think it's hand-painted. Yeah. Here we have the plan. Here we have the elevation in its full. Now you will note something that is very, very strange. There is an Ionic column. There are Ionic columns, and there's a Doric entablature. Very naughty. Extreme, I mean, completely out of the question, actually. What went on in his mind? Yeah? I mean, he must have known this is wrong. Yeah? We don't know. He doesn't talk about it. This is the cellar on the inside. Okay, quite good taste, isn't it? And this is the longitudinal section. Coupe longitudinale du temple. This is actually detail. So we, of course, get the whole geschäft of the paintings, and it is a bit Hockney, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it's a. This is a.
You took the book already. I couldn't choose the after you. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I'm just a bit faster. That's it.
Often.
Okay. You are a busy boy. Anyway, I'm going through this quite quickly. I mean, you see, he's also really looking at the possible alternatives, and you can imagine. I mean, these pictures were in the eventual book, but of course they were prepared by beautiful drawings first. That is what Hittorf showed. The beautiful drawings used to be in the City Archive of Cologne. Until the archivist actually sold them to important Nazis in the 1930s. So they weren't even lost in the floods. They'd gone before. I understand. Anyway, and he is very precise. I mean, we get what is it? The various details, the metopes, the parts of the cornice. And he also shows it's avec et sans stuc. I mean, there's obviously also this sort of question. Yeah, it was a sort of question about the treatment of the surface. Yeah, I'm just showing you these. I don't need to say very much, do I? I thought this is also very beautiful. But imagine, I mean, showing this as the frieze of the Pantheon. Of course, what Hittorf... Huh? Parthenon, yeah. Sorry, yes. Not the Pantheon. Because what Hittorf actually says, and that is perhaps the greatest offense, the sacrilegious statement, he says all Greek architecture was colored. Not just this architecture in Magna Graecia, not just this sort of, perhaps not entirely proper stuff. No, even the big things on the Acropolis, they were colored. And that was actually perhaps what was really offensive, the idea that the Parthenon was suggested as colored. Now, I thought this was a fantastic idea for Ionic capital. And the second thing is, and this would be another lecture, I'm not going to go very much into detail, but he's also interested in Etruscan precedents that he shares, in fact, with Labouste, he's a bit younger. Labouste is a bit younger than Hittorf. And the young folks in the academy are very interested in the Etruscans, because the Etruscans are not properly classical. The Etruscans are sort of primitive. The Etruscans are forceful. And, you know, as much as in the early 20th century, the Doric is the goût du jour, the Etruscans also have that sort of effect. Yeah, in order to get out of the classical system. Here we have the colored columns and so on. Now, very quickly now, Hittorf is attacked for being an architect. And that's also why I thought it was great for today, because, you know, Kersten is an architect very much interested in theory and history. Yeah.
Not as good as you, but I'm interested. Yeah.
Hang on, I have a career
Of course.
in that, and you can just, yeah, you can use it in what you're doing. Now, what Hittorf is suggesting, no, this is, I mean, I think productively, what Hittorf is interested in is of course the history as a resource for his own work. Yeah, and this is actually the last plate in the book, which is the Church of Saint-Vincent de Paul, which is a church that he is then building, because in the course of all this hoo-ha about the polychromie and also getting the book printed, he is working on Saint-Vincent de Paul, which is in fact the most important work he's done. Okay, this is the Paris de Hittorf. This is the his drawing of the circle of, well, I don't know, winter or what, some I've forgotten. But this is Saint-Vincent de Paul. In reality, he actually designed also the hall and with colored mosaics, and they were thought to be so extreme that they were thought to be sort of a bit over the top, so they were actually taken down afterwards. So he's a naughty man. This is his drawing. This is the sighting. Yeah, okay, almost done. Why is this book of interest? I mean, I think one thing that one could say is there is something about the media in architecture. What happened in the 20 years of between, let's say, Hittorf's travel to Italy and while the polychromy debate was going on, printing technology developed quite fast, and the main thing is that a new technique called chromolithography was invented, and this was invented in the sort of late 1830s, and as far as I know, this is actually one of the first books which was produced in that technique, which meant that, of course, you didn't have to find children doing all the painting, yeah, or find somebody who could do it. No, you could actually print it. This was a high-class publication, but it was a mass-produced thing. So you could also say, I don't know, I haven't found any evidence of the print runs, but you could actually sort of do a reasonably high print run of a color publication, which of course makes it into something completely different. Yeah? Which also means that perhaps the rhetorical strength of Hittorf's publication was much bigger because you had this new technology. So that's I think we always look for technology interfering with the way that we look at the world, and this is an example. Second thing is, of course, that Hittorf was very free in using his color schemes also in buildings that he did. Saint-Vincent de Paul is evidence for that. You could say, is that really significant? Well, I mean, Saint-Vincent de Paul is definitely one of the best buildings of the 19th century in Paris, but generally speaking, perhaps it's a sideshow. But what Hittorf is doing, I think, is also something else, and that's slightly paradoxical, perhaps, because color in Hittorf's drawings becomes contour.
So Winkelmann talks, I think, had overlooked the difference in the effect of color between architecture and sculpture. In sculpture, you could say color undermines the effect of the sculpture. In architecture, it does something completely different. It highlights the contours of the elements, almost like in a didactic textbook. And that means the onlooker is invited to read them as separate. It also means that by stressing the contours, it emphasizes the effect of the line and the play and its play in architecture. So strangely, it's not only didactic classicism, but it's actually also about architecture being made of lines. And later, we get a sort of conversation that the line is exactly that which establishes authorship in architecture. Now, I'm not sure that Hittorf was aware of any of this, but of course, often books have an effect that is completely unpredicted and unpremeditated. And that is perhaps the last remark I want to make. I think I also feel reminded, in the case of Hittorf, of a famous dictum of Karl Scheffler about the architect Alfred Messel. You probably know it, when he says that Messel was not, I'm paraphrasing, wasn't quite aware of his own modernity. He was very modern, perhaps even the most modern person of his time in Berlin, but he wasn't aware of it. And I also think that is probably true to say about Hittorf. Thank you.
Wow, Christoph, this was quite something, huh? I mean, after all your color, I even start black and white. I mean, well, first of all, Anja and Sophia, thank you very much for inviting me as well. I mean, and Christoph for being this great company. I mean, I have the feeling I'm a bit the after party, so that's also good. It's or after the party, if you understand the joke a little bit. After the party, perhaps in the sense that I mean, I do black and white after color, and I do just images after theory. So I mean, I will kind of ask you to invent the whole life and career of Paul Letarouilly. While looking at this book, I will not tell you anything about him. He's French. He's French. He made the book in 1840, so kind of the same time. I think 12 years before Hittorf, which is 1852, I think. Well, the plates were earlier, but the book was
much earlier. So
the chrome-plated or the color-printed book is from 1852, if I'm not mistaken.
I thought 1851. But
oh, 51, sorry. I'm sorry. Plus minus a year. Letarouilly's book is from 1840, and I think it's even 1840 till 1855, because I believe he used 15 years to kind of get the 3 volumes together. And it's a bit the result of a trip to Rome. He was French, so he could go there. He was eligible, let's say, in the 1820s. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry to not give you more precise dating here. Now, this book I chose out of the many possible books I could choose in this marvelous library, and it's very hard, and maybe. I mean, and I kind of sympathize with what you were saying, Christoph, a little bit, because I believe as an architect in this library of an architect, you look for a book perhaps very much with an architect's mind. I mean, I do not want to show you the book with the most historical value, or, I mean, and as much as I adored your lecture, Christoph, also simply because I think I look for tools, in a sense. Perhaps in the same way as I suspect, Ungers himself was looking for tools or was collecting certain books, sometimes with great knowledge on the why and the where and the impact it had at the time, but equally so simply because it gave a certain inspiration, a way of drawing, a way of depicting, a way of collecting, a way of arguing. So for me, the Rome moderne, so another French book, a modern Rome, or the édifice du Rome moderne, so the buildings of modern Rome, and modern is here to be understood as the Renaissance, is as much a collection of buildings as it is, you could say, an argument about a certain architecture. And in that sense, and of course, if you're here in this place, perhaps the first other architect, at least which came to my mind, was Schinkel, rather than Letarouilly, that architect who we only know because of his book. Now, truth is that, of course, Schinkel does this Italian trip also in the 1820s, actually his second trip in 1823. Ungers wrote this beautiful text, I think, on Schinkel, 5 lessons from Schinkel's work in 1981 for Cornell, the Cornell Journal of Architecture. And quite much in parallel, he made this other book, which everybody knows, of course, which is this Architecture as a Theme, which in a strange way also has 5 themes. And though the themes are slightly different, you could say that if you close your eyes a little bit while listening, there's an amazing overlap between these 2 ideas. So you could argue that somehow you need to read almost both texts to understand what he's really about. I think there's a certain desire for clarity in Architecture as a Theme, but in some strange way, in this very compact version of learning from Schinkel, one could say, I think there's a certain directness and an evidence which in this slightly artificial construction in finding 5 clearly or not so clearly defined maybe in the end, but nameable themes escapes a bit. Perhaps also because Ungers in Architecture as a Theme, I would dare to say desperately, wants to show his own work. And I think as an architect, the biggest mistake you can make, is talk about references and then talk about your own work. I mean, somehow, and certainly when you would talk about the Renaissance, you're bound to fail. So here, no work. At the same time, the presentation has 2 parts. Very quickly, you could say 5 projects and a half and a conclusion from Letarouilly's Rome Moderne. And then kind of clicking through a little book, I'll show it to you afterwards, this one here, Conventional Wisdom, which is not my work, it's not our work, but it's work of the students, and I believe has somehow, and it is in color, which is important, and has somehow has an echo of that very book. So good, here Letarouilly, and these are the 4 pictures I got from the archive here to verify if we talk about the same book, and it's really the same book. I only have a kind of a 90s version, which is still very beautiful, I can recommend. But this is the real deal, as you can see, with loose plates. I will not talk about these plates now because I will talk about them a little bit later. And this is a zoom in, and I think for me the most interesting and most important drawing of that book, which is the very last page of the 3rd book. So in fact the very, very last drawing in that collection of Letarouilly. And it's a zoom in of that one, and you can read it here, and my Italian should be better than this, but it's extremely bad, especially on occasions as this. It's kind of, if you study Rome and its monuments, we are looking only at the art of Peruzzi and Bramante, which is absolutely amazing, as you can see here. And in other words, collecting the buildings of the Renaissance is an ideological project. I very much, of course, was interested in that project because you see, of course, the wolf of Rome, let's say, with Romulus and Remus. You see a person probably exactly doing that, studying and explaining the idea of the ancients, or better here, of the Renaissance, and studying Rome. But we read his mind. You can almost see there's a contemporary text balloon. If you study Rome, it's Bramante and Peruzzi where you have to go. Now, fascinatingly, this image, as the last page of the book, is an image, and I hope you can see it a little bit, it's there. And it's not a building of Peruzzi or Bramante, no, on the contrary, it's in the back, almost like a kind of, if you were talking about naughty, hidden in the Campidoglio of course, Michelangelo. So, fascinatingly, you could say, he felt maybe in the 1920s, 1940s, forced to finish a book on the buildings of Rome, or the Renaissance in Rome, with that very Capitol Hill, I mean, famous, certainly at that time, and famous for its splendor. but secretly he makes us aware of what his book is really about. So despite the fact that I think the project of the Capitol Hill as it was finished by Michelangelo is interesting in its own right, and it's interesting for, you could argue, from a perspective of an architecture of assemblage. One of the themes of architecture is the theme. It is obviously one of the most clear and evident examples of buildings which together seem to make an architecture of the city. It is ultimately, I would argue, not there where Letarouilly wants us to look at, but rather in, I would say, other extremes. And here in the corridor there's plenty of depictions. I mean, there's one in the corridor and there's later a little bit deeper in the complex here, also a very beautiful plaster model of the very same building, the Tempietto of Bramante. You could say, if we discuss architecture in Rome, or if you would like to discuss architecture in general, perhaps if you put two extremes, it is probably spun between, on the one hand, the Tempietto, and on the other hand, that will be the second building I wanted to show, the Santa Maria del Pace. So, Tempietto being, you could say, the ultimate idea of an object, or to speak in Ungarsian terms of architecture as a theme, a doll in a doll. I mean, an object which so much on its own that it somehow survives as an idea of architecture, which in its endless repetition makes an argument for its very architecture. And perhaps, and of course it's always difficult to connect themes with one or another. Here we go very quickly through Bramantes, of course, San Pietro Montorio. We all know the different plans, the executed one as opposed to the one which at least, what's it again, makes us believe was supposed to be the original. The different drawings, it's even true that in the second and in the third book, and it's very bad the quality here, I'm so sorry, it's a little bit overlit, but doesn't matter, you see in each of its details the Tempietto. The second building I wanted to show is, of course, as I said, the Santa Maria del Pace. It's very opposite, you could say, a building fitting in a very complex urban environment. I mean, next to the Santa Maria del Pace church, with a beautiful Raphael painting, later transformed in the front by Pietro da Cortona as a very particular, very interesting square. Something which, by the way, Letarouilly is not interested in this book.
Squares?
Well, no, that's very square in front. And of course, I would say an argument of assemblage, assemblage of opposites. Santa Maria del Pace here as a perimeter, so the object in the perimeter, but at the same time the doll in the doll, and the assemblage of opposites, where one project in all its, I would say, directness is able to overcome the impossible sighting of what's already there. So here you see that. Very beautiful perspective, which you cannot see at all in this. I'm really sorry. You did better with the scans in color. I mean, that was the story. Now, of course, if we talk Bramante and Peruzzi, the second in line is Peruzzi, and as you probably all know, Peruzzi is one of these disciples of Bramante, and of course, by pointing out to the lineage Bramante and Peruzzi, Letarouilly inscribes in an argument of architecture for the city, which of course I would say results from that famous kind of debate of Julius II asking Bramante to do the Belvedere. The Belvedere, which in fact is in another set of books by Letarouilly, which is not in this one here, the St. Peter's. The Belvedere, which was then, of course, together with the St. Peter's, and especially the St. Peter's taken over by Michelangelo, so which became, in some sense, you could argue, the arch-enemy, and I oversimplify, of the Bramante gang. So if the Bramante gang was Bramante, Peruzzi, Raphael, indirectly Giulio Romano, and certainly also Antonio Sangallo the Younger. Here you have Peruzzi with the Farnesina, later called the Farnesina, of course, the moment the Farnese family bought it. And this very beautiful villa on the other side of the Tiber, you could argue is the most, here you can read it.
Yeah.
You can't, I'm really sorry. Is, you could say perhaps the most extreme incarnation of architecture as an idea. The facades, you have to believe, are fantastic. The same goes with the perspectives. Here, the amazing room with the ceiling painted by Raphael. In a way, a plan, I should go back here, which in many ways kind of, I would say, precedes the Cours d'honneur, perhaps the most kind of French of all architectural types, but that done in Italy about 100 years earlier.
It's a bit like cuisine, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit the same. Yeah. And ultimately, of course, an argument of a building which so much stands on its own that it is able, as architecture as an idea, to make a world on its own. The second project of Peruzzi I wanted to show is perhaps the most famous one. It's Palazzo Massimo alla Colonne. As you can see here a little bit, the facade. In fact, it's part of a cluster of 3 palazzi, and interestingly so, in a sense that it is more than anything an architecture of adaptation or assimilation. It's an architecture which understands in the very moment that none of its microfacts will be pure, but the complexity of the whole manages to make a kind of assimilated, adapted world in the world. So here you see hopefully a little bit the facade of the most famous of the 3, let's say. Actually there were 2 brothers and 1 relative, so the 2 brothers built these palazzi. They negotiated forever about this little corner here because Peruzzi needed it for his famous entrée vestibule. So he kind of took it from his other brother. You have the 2 axes, and
he did the colonnade, you know.
And he did the colonnade,
which was a total exception in Rome.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. I mean,
no, but Rome actually prevented colonnades
for housing.
Yeah,
absolutely. No. So here, the colonnade, the vestibule. You see it here. Letarouilly was very aware, I think, of all the elements. I mean, it's about decoration, of course, but it's also about the spatial sequence of certain ideas. So here you see the colonnade, the entrance vestibule, you see the architecture of it, and you see, and I think that's very interestingly, so, well, again, you don't see anything of it, I'm so sorry, but you see the perspective of that very vestibule, of that very colonnade, as in a way its main architecture feat. The section, you see how in a way haphazard the building is. I mean, it has a court, it has a colonnade, and it has a very beautiful bel étage room, and all the rest is in a way organized so that you could experience these things in sequence and immediately forgetting how you got there. I think that's very interesting in that. So in that sense, I think as an architecture of adaptation or assimilation is perhaps the most exquisite example. So I have a 3,000 slides of this, but I will skip them, as you can see, and you don't see them anyhow. So
they do have a strange beauty like this, don't
They do.
a little bit too, or maybe it's our angle. Would it be better for the audience? I hope it is. From here you don't see anything of this. Okay, it doesn't matter. The last building, the last and almost last, which I wanted to show you, was of course the Palazzo Farnese by Antonio Sangallo the Younger. Why that one? It doesn't particularly fit the idea of transformation, which is the 5th theme of Humor's, morphology, gestalt, as they said typically in the 80s, we would call it form perhaps. Gestalt is one of these weird words which totally got dated. I mean, you cannot use the word gestalt or people think you're a 70s hippie or something. But anyways, at least in my circle.
I think you may be excused now.
I did it. Okay.
Child of the 70s, of course.
What was interesting in the light of the comment, of course, of Bramante and Peruzzi, he did not mention Sangallo, but he didn't mention Michelangelo, and of course Michelangelo is often connected, or very much connected, with this building. I tend to think that the version Letarouilly draws is even the one without the Michelangelo corniche, which is interesting. So he, in a way, tries to use the book to correct the dominance of Michelangelo over, I would say, the then current discourse of Italian architecture. fantastic plan. I mean, it's an architecture of plans. You're probably not surprised. I like it very much. Amazing details, of course. Genius facade, indeed. Still with the old second floor.
This actually looks like Wuppertal. This looks like Wuppertal. There's a bank
Wuppertal.
exactly like this.
Okay, Wuppertal in Rome. I promised I would go fast. Here, the entrance vestibule, of course, to be meant for the Bourbon kings. Later the Bourbon kings classic sculpture, which then all moved to Napoli in this fantastic museum on the hill. And we go through the detailing. Kept far too many slides, I'm so sorry. To what in the book of Architecture as a Theme was perhaps something as a conclusion. So the conclusion of this book I see very much through the eyes of Letarouilly in perhaps the closest to contemporary. I mean, he was not exactly contemporary, but he was, I would say, a classicist, which was at least not 250 years away from him, but only a couple, like 100 and a bit, 120, 130 years away. So you have here Vignola and Amanati, famous Villa Giulia. I mean, Vignola was still pretty much a contemporary of Bramante, Raphael and Sangallo, but Amanati was the one who was then finally finishing this building, which is in many ways, I believe, a densification of an argument of architecture of history. So it's, of course, Vignola, for his own Vignola book, famous as an architect, ultimately of an accumulation of knowledge, more than an inventor, but able in this accumulation, whereas each of the different pieces you could somehow recognize, and that of course certainly counted for his different orders and how he would organize them. He would do them better, more precise, more, controlled than any of his contemporaries. The architecture he made, and here you see that, is of course one where only the accumulation of, I would say, hitherto conflicting architectural ideas would come to a complete, coherent, not maybe this drawing, or this one. It's very sad because perspectives I think are important. Architectural corpus. But ultimately, of course, what I want to do with showing you this Letarouilly as an ideological document and as an argument for a certain architecture is perhaps opening the door, a door we have opened in the years since then for ourselves, especially in the context of academia, where you understand that architecture, and I believe that's very much also the core argument Ungers, Oswald Matthias, tried to develop when he talked about what he could learn from Schinkel's work, his 5 points. It was very much written, and I reread it on the way here one more time, it was very much written in, say, the early 80s as an argument against an all too easy, I would say, accumulation of architectural forms, because he would argue Schinkel's architecture, he said it's en vogue now, in Tokyo and Paris, in New York, it's part of the party talk. And ultimately, I believe his 5 points, whether then in a slightly different version, translated into a hypothetical set of themes of his own work, or 5 points in an attempt to liberate Schinkel by taking Schinkel more seriously, I think opens up a way of dealing with history in architecture, which I think is fundamental for us architects, which is recognizing maybe more than the generation before us. I talk about my generation, so that is architecture, and I was very happy that Sofia mentioned our trip with San Rocco, going to see Bramante and stopping at every single building thinking it was possibly Bramante, but maybe it was also not. I think ultimately it's also a little bit about having a freedom, a lightness, about on the one hand taking each of these architectures seriously, but on the other hand not trying to fall in the trope of the easy, I would say, figurative copy. Now, you can do that in many ways. You can do that by saying that you're somehow, and that's what perhaps a certain kind of modernist did, being in love with the Doric column and somehow find their excuse to make a kind of, very heavy steel rhythm with the roof. I mean, there's examples of that in the recent past. But I think ultimately it can also be that you can, what you could say, try to collect conventional wisdom. Here you see that. It's a little book here. That's a book we did recently, last year, with the students of the EPFL in Lausanne, where on the one hand you try to avoid what nowadays is a bit too easily called postmodern copy-paste, simply not by saying I see a set of beautiful columns, an arch, tympanon and so forth, and I try to find an appropriate kind of contemporary question for which this is already the right answer, but rather by maybe, I would dare to say pretty much in Letarouilly's fashion, I don't know, I mean that was certainly a little bit the desire, the idea, to take an architecture seriously, and here this is the architecture of Antonio Zangallo and his actually uncle Antonio Zangallo and his other uncle Giuliano Zangallo seriously. So here this window is what you could say a Zangallo window. It's a window of which somehow historically, I mean by many scholars busy with the matter, is considered Zangalesque in how it manages to frame the window as an element and understand that an architecture could be developed from the window only, rather than an order in a facade in which, of course, the order always has to fit. And perhaps Zangallo's biggest contribution, and that is more Antonio the Younger than any of the other two, I mean, probably Giuliano being the most excellent architect of the three, I mean, the oldest, architect in Firenze in the Quattrocento, so in the 1500s, Antonio the Younger being an architect in Rome in the 16th century in the Cinquecento, and of course also Antonio the Younger being a disciple, of course, of Bramante. So this very little book, what did it do? And I just go very quickly through it while not stopping at a single image, but you see there's color. It tried to collect all the work of the Zangallos, you could say, or the Zangallan sect. Try to redraw every single building we could find of the Zangallo sect. Many of these, whether it was from Antonio the Elder, the Younger, or Giuliano, was either... Oh, it went a bit fast. What is that? Ah, okay. Well, I'll go back then. I kept on pressing. It doesn't work. The argument was here that the buildings which we could find, we tried to understand if they always were like they were. The buildings which were documented, we tried to redocument in the way we found them, and I tried to combine the different documents and understand where they were contradicting. But as many buildings simply were projects. And the projects, as they were, the students finally had to finish. The students did not have to translate the architecture of the past into the present. They simply had to pretend they were, you could say, employees of the Zangallo office in 1525. So the result was, and this is Giuliano Zangallo, famous building, Rocca Pisana. It's Rocca Pisano is another guy, San Subino. But here, the famous Poggio Caiano villa next to Firenze. I mean, famous for its being the first villa of the Renaissance, one could say, for the Medici. But for example, this project is complete hypothesis based on this existing plan. This, I mean, I go for a bit more extreme, perhaps. This project, a very famous plan of Giuliano Zangallo, possibly for a villa outside Firenze. This is a hypothesis of a section of facade, and this is a hypothesis of how it looked like. I would say very similar to your kind of color hypothesis you just showed. So for us, and I think it's surprising to what extent, for example, these drawings are similar to what you showed before. But for me also it's surprising how similar they are, because if you would check Letarouilly and you would check the Belvedere of Bramante, you realize it has nothing to do with the real Belvedere, and it has nothing to do with the Belvedere he would have found. It's a hypothesis of what the Belvedere would have probably liked to be. I think ultimately it is actually there. Can you imagine? I mean, and Giuliano Sangallo, neo-Roman, kind of, I would say, fun villa. I mean, David Hockney is not very far away.
No, it actually also not been a Bobardi in those drawings like that as well.
And at the same time, it is based on the plan. I mean, and it took the plan extremely serious, and it's as much a reconstruction as, say, Bruschi's reconstructions are of the Belvedere, because also he has no information. And it's as much a reconstruction, I believe, as Letarouilly's Edifice de Rome are reconstructions. And ultimately, I think it's an exercise in trying to define what kind of architecture, and this conventional wisdom is of course about what architecture we are interested in, the students are interested in. And so while making a book, you could argue, you make almost like a doll in a doll architecture as an idea. Thank you.
Into the thinking of Kersten Geers more than anything else, which for me I was hoping we would be able to see a little into his mind. So thank you very much.
Oh, well,
to both of you. Are there any questions to the audience? Or is everybody a little dumbfounded? Or scared to speak English? You could say it in German too, and I will translate.
Which palazzo was the Sangallo window?
Actually, the Sangallo window, photographed by Stefano Graziani, by the way, is, oh yeah, that's the microphone, it's much better, is to be found in the Castel Sant'Angelo, because many architects intervene in Castel Sant'Angelo.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you look at, for example, I think it's here, the typical, we all know, Palazzo Farnese, here, it's Palazzo Farnese, here, as you can see. It has the same window up to point, meaning it has the window which is on its own, because I could not talk too much into detail, but what's amazing is that this palazzo was not thinkable without the solitary window, because even the Massimo Colonne by Peruzzi, which I showed before in the Letarouilly, is an amazing palazzo. It's true, it has a colonnade on the base. Bramante would have made a rusticated base, but still they would have kept the orders in a very logical way and the proportions. Sangallo the younger was a commercial architect. I did not manage to talk about this, but Antonio Sangallo, you could say, was almost like the McKinley and White of his time. He took all the drawings of his uncles. His uncles were somehow involved as you could say, inspirers, kind of emeritus figures who kind of gave glamour to the practice, and he built whatever he could. And of course, he was a good builder. His buildings did not leak. His roof details were okay. I mean, and as a result, he had his work. So he was essentially working for the Farnese family. Because what became Pope Farnese was, he was the most powerful figure in Rome roughly after Julius II died for 50 years. So almost every single building you see in the little book is done somehow for the Farneses, if they were not done earlier in Firenze. And so also when he was the Pope, he asked Sangallo to modify again Castel Sant'Angelo. And that window there is the most clear, because you could say the only thing he did is adding a few windows, as opposed to, well, the palazzi, which are of course many more things than that. Sorry to give such a long answer to it.
No, thank you.
Does people dare to ask more questions? Do people dare?
Do you have any questions to each other then? Just one or two?
Well, I had a question to you, Christoph. Well, it's a remarkable question, because I was very fascinated by your story about Hittorf, because I had the impression you told a similar, I mean much more precise than what I do here in my messy lecture, but a very clear account of an architect who, when was it, in 1821 or 23, does this mise en scène for the marriage of the Duke of Bordeaux. You see the color, you see the generosity, you see the architecture, that's what he wants to make. He goes to Italy, he goes to Sicily, he sees Greek architecture, and he makes, in a way, a publication which legitimizes everything he does after that.
Yeah.
Or am I too simple when I say it?
Well,
because in a way,
okay, let's say that's one. Well, do I agree? I think I can actually use this. Can't
yeah,
I?
you have a better voice than me.
Put it on here, yes.
Yeah, because otherwise I just keep fiddling with the same thing.
I do it.
But I've got too loud a voice. No, I think of course there's a career move in there. In fact, I didn't talk about this at length, but Hittorf is also invented or rediscovered when the Beaux-Arts is being rediscovered in the 1980s and 90s. But he's given rather bad press by someone like Middleton, for example, who just says, well, he's only interested in the career move aspect of things. I'm not sure that's entirely fair to the man, because he actually was quite versatile. He also did do Gothic when it was strictly speaking necessary. And he was not only fixed to one particular type of language. And in that sense, he was, of course, very much an architect of his time. What he didn't do, I mean, if you compare things, then let's say the creative spirit of somebody like Le Proust, and how Le Proust, for example, reinvents architecture, that is probably something he couldn't do. But then you can also say the book was probably necessary for Le Proust to sort of have the inventions that he then made. I mean, there's also the question. I mean, one of the things that's, I think, great about this evening is, of course, that we look at building books from the mid-19th century, and what we're looking for is basically how does one invent architecture?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Totally.
And I think that's partly inventing is always about looking. To some degree, it's probably about learning. You could say, the Polychromie was about learning, about didactic. But it's not only that. It's when these pictures are actually there, they actually have a reality by themselves, and they become either fascinating or revolting.
But I think it's also about remaking, in a sense that, I was here downstairs, I think it is, right, where the plaster models are. Are they here made? Yeah. And I mean, of course, I was also very fascinated to see this and I think it's luckily coming back in a sense. But it is by making these plaster models, even if it's of the Tempietto or whatever it is, that you understand the Tempietto. So your work is outside of that. That's also what I wanted to say here today. I mean, we do not make neoclassicist buildings at all. At the same time, maybe they are neoclassicists, but in a very strange, way. They could be interpreted.
I think if you use the distinction of classical versus Gothic that James Gowan formulated, then you are classicists. But then, of course, that depends.
Which is fine. I'm proud classicist. My point is, it doesn't look the same. It doesn't look the same. That I find interesting. But at the same time, and I must say, we also learned that in the last years with the students and so forth. To try to, we also have to explain to the students these type of things, what's the point in finishing a building like that? Well, the point is the same way as if somebody goes and works in an architecture office and says, we here in the office, we do things that way. It's the same thing. You have to try to understand the syntax of a certain work, and you have to try to be creative within that syntax. Because he said, look, you have to not see it as a silly exercise in trying to make a historical book. No, you see it as you're working in the office of Antonio Sangallo the Younger. He said, look, Farnese had told me I have to travel what is it, 100 kilometers north of Rome to finish that building, he's gone for 3 months. You know what I mean? And so then, you're there in this office, what do I have to do? I don't know, I mean, and so, I mean, I know I have examples what he did, I know a little bit what he wants. That's interesting.
I actually think that at this moment we probably need some kind of pretentious humility to make architecture. Pretentious in the sense that you really don't think of architecture simply as problem solving. You really think of it as something that you want to immerse yourself in history. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also because it helps you to invent things. Mm-hmm. But of course the humility aspect is that in order to invent something, it's actually good to have looked at stuff and really measured things. I mean, that's also the interesting thing about when you look at all these excavations. You know, I mean, obviously you learn a lot. In a way, I think in these books we now find a space that we may not find in the architecture that has been produced
today.
Right now.
Yeah. But, sorry.
But what you were saying about the work influencing you, but you're not looking at like the buildings that were built in those days. And there is a movement, especially in Germany, of people pretty much rebuilding old buildings.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Which is so, this historicism I call it, which is so application, it has nothing to do with architecture. It's a much harder and more intelligent way to base yourself on this, but interpret it in a modern, with modern material, with modern functions and what the new users need, but not to look like you're just reproducing a villa of the 19th century. But that is such a problem nowadays.
No, but I mean, Sophia, you're totally right. But it's what I find funny is that it's a problem today. But if I read your father's text, 5 Lessons on Schinkel, he was facing the same problem. On the one hand, I mean, let's say it's 2 pages. The version I have here, the first page, he's attacking, say, what you could call the postmodernists, that they were too easily embracing all kind of tropes of Schinkelianisms, a bit like from a fashion store, and you apply it there and there and there, and everything sticks. And on the second page, he attacks all the modernists who then think, we walk to your camp again. No. He was absolutely against every of these. So. And let's say the Berlin dilemma of yes or no reconstructing the Bach Academy, and I was telling you on the phone that with the students now we are working actually, the whole year is Schinkel, but we are not, we're doing the Bach Academy, but we're doing it somewhere else, in Berlin, in contemporary architecture, you could say. But at the same time, the argument that the building coincides with its content, which is an amazing thing about the Schinkel Bach Academy, you know, he builds a building for himself, he works there, he lives there, he teaches there, and it's at the same time the last piece to organize his urban kind of pittoresque kind of mise en scène in a sense, and pittoresque I use in the open-minded way, not in the postcard way. I mean, so this strategy, which I also read through Oswald Matthias' text, I mean, it's fundamental. We have to learn from the strategy, we have to sort of learn from the precision, but to do the same there now again is total nonsense. I mean, you know, you do not want to do that. I mean, that's sadness. I mean, and I think for me, what I see in the Hittorf even is indeed, I think for me it's almost like breaking a status quo, but you bring it also like that. No? Christoph, whether or not he was right or wrong, and whether his color hypotheses were the right ones, you feel that he's dealing with these monuments. And there's too much consensus about how you can keep it calm and conservative.
No, I actually think that was probably his greatest strength, is that he was aware that he was doing rather, let's say, serious scholarly work, but that was not the only driving force. You can't hear me?
No, the back not. I'll play the microphone. Yeah, he was aware.
So he was. And I think he was actually taking more freedom than just being the archaeologist here. Yeah. And of course, in that sense, the archaeologists probably were slightly right that he was
that he was wrong. Exactly. Yeah.
On the other hand, they weren't actually that correct either. So in a way, you could say it's both about let's say the architect making some steps that the scholar wouldn't have done, and actually finding out things that the scholars wouldn't have found. And at the same time, he's more interested in doing something with these findings eventually in his own architecture. And then the question is whether he's not doing it too literally, and whether the people who actually learned his lessons better were then also the architects whose architecture we still remember. Having said this, I also think it's interesting he was the architect of a city.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, some of these other architects perhaps did one or two great buildings, but they didn't really have a concept of that city. So I think there are also different levels at which these things are true. Yeah, and that's also what I get from your interventions on the.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, wow, this is super loud now, all of a sudden. Well, no, but I mean, in that sense, Zangalo is an interesting figure. He might not be Hittorf, but he's a bit, it's a bit similar.
Yeah.
Bit similar, because I mean, if I say, ironically, architecture of Bramante and Peruzzi, I mean, yes, I mean, these are the masterpieces, right?
Yeah.
But Zangalo is then forgotten because he, in a way, he made, well, I wanted that sort of...
Well, the historians are usually rude about him too.
Totally. No, they hate Zangalo the younger. I mean, they think he's an idiot in some sense, a commercial architect. That's funny because I showed before the Letarouilly on Peruzzi's Massimo Colonne building. Well, that's the second building for the other brother. So here on this view, you can hardly see it. In the white on here, this area, is the one with the columns.
Okay.
And this one is the one for the other brother. It was done by Zangalo. And so, although in the complex of in the drawings of Letarouilly, they're both somehow attributed to Peruzzi, is not true. I mean, this one, and you also immediately see it's a Zangalo building. You know, it's like the way you can recognize, the same window from a kilometer distance.
And ironically, of course, that's also the architecture which
makes the city. Yeah.
Exactly. It's also the architecture that then can be copied after for the Roma Italiana in the 19th century.
Totally. And it's even true that we had a bit the same sensation as with the fragments of Bramante when we were doing with the students research. You walk around the city and you always think, this is Zangalo. Oh no, this is Zangalo. Because they all look the same. Well, I mean, and the copies look as good as the original. I mean, here you see the plan of it. But anyway, that's for a side remark.
Dann, Dankeschön.